Corruption is another of the criminal activities that may increase and perhaps be covered up as a result of the work of the Financial Oversight Board. Dr. Jose Atilio Osorio from the University of Puerto Rico and Mayagüez estimated that around 33 billion of the alleged debt is management cost. UBS, Santander, and others design, advise, and manage money from Puerto Rico's retirement funds and other sources, as well as sold these plans. Curiously, some members of the Oversight Board come from this financial elite. Accordingly to Dr. Atiles, Congress facilitated the cover-up by preventing the Security and Exchange Commission from exercising jurisdiction. Nothing in the law requires auditing the debt unless the Fiscal Oversight Board decided to, which seems highly unlikely. And yet, auditing is a measure of a healthy and responsible fiscal policy. Finally, another potential source of violence, typical in savage neoliberalism, is the use of the public agencies in charge of maintaining law and order or protection of the powerful to also control the protester or those who exercise their freedom of speech and peacefully assembly protected under the First Amendment. The Puerto Rican legislature just recently approved amendment to the penal code criminalizing the right to protest. History has documented a lot of repressive measures, violence, and social unrest in places where austerity measures were applied. There's no reason to believe it will be any different in Puerto Rico. It's urgent to take measures that guarantee balance between fiscal and social responsibility. The Oversight Board needs to understand that they are dealing with people's lives and not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Important human rights organizations like Amnesty International and renowned experts like Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz have called for different strategies and warned of the risk of human rights violation as a result of austerity policies. The people of Puerto Rico need to start public and community talks, un diálogo nacional, to better understand the nature of the crisis and to approach it from a more participatory democracy. Is it possible? Only time will tell. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Ashley Ortiz Chico from the University of Connecticut Stores. Ortiz Chico received her bachelor's in political science with a specialty in international relations and political theory, and a minor in Latin American and Puerto Rican literature from the Universidad de Puerto Rico, Recinto de Rio Piedras, in 2016. Ortiz Chico is a graduate student pursuing a Master of Arts in Latino and Latin American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Her paper is titled Promesa Rota: Human Rights in Puerto Rico's Debt Crisis.
Good morning. First, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for having me. This is my first time presenting in a conference. So this is a work in progress, and it kind of arose out of the recent report by the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations, Juan Pablo Boholavsky, and the claim that human rights cannot be sidelined in Puerto Rico's debt crisis. I couldn't help but ask certain questions. Are Puerto Ricans subjects or even objects of rights? Our complicated political positionality mediates between the inhabitants of the island and our access to rights at a constitutional level, let alone at an international level. Furthermore, I wondered about the broader project of human rights. Have human rights actually been a method of spreading Western capitalist values throughout the world? Is Promesa a violation of human rights faced by Puerto Ricans? Or is it the culmination and continuation of capitalist violence that has been permitted under the existing human rights framework? I quote, "The Financial Oversight and Management Board dealing with the crisis must ensure that economic, social, and cultural rights are not undermined by giving absolute priority to creditors' rights and by imposing excessive austerity. Mr. Bohostowski. What the Special Rapporteur's comments lead us to believe is that human rights abiding policy is incongruent with the neoliberal measures that are taking place in the island. This ignores the ways in which human rights institutions are complicit in generating the circumstances that lead to economic crisis. The Human Rights Project is tied to a Western idea of development. Felix Gaume, writing from the British Cameroons in 1958, wrote, "We had been fooled into thinking that the UN watches over the entire world. But now we come back to our certainty that the two, French and British authorities, are the ones who watch over subordinate nations. Subordination in this case can be equated with underdevelopment. Development became the yardstick through which countries were measured and controlled. It replaced humanity or conceptions of civilization as the excuse through which the West could intervene in another country." Referring to Truman's point 4, the final part of his inaugural address delivered in 1949, Suarez Crabbe argues, "Here, the term underdevelopment, used for the first time in a text with wide circulation, illustrates how human rights and development continue to interlock. Rights, such as liberty and peace, legitimized the civilizing mission and development practices, providing now universal fundament to them. At the same time, the notion of underdevelopment was the new expression to refer to lack of humanity or subhumanity, reinforced by Truman's explicit rejection of the old imperialism. The speech epitomizes the replacement of European administrative colonialism, which for the most part had collapsed at the end of the Second World War, with US-driven neocolonialism carried by the notion of free markets, science, and technology as the solution to all evils." End quote. My critique of human rights arises from the need to contextualize them historically. The limits of rights lie precisely in their conception. Before we decide to use the human rights language, we have to question what the project actually entails and what tools it provides. If human rights was originally a colonial project, that does not necessarily mean that we cannot use them as using the master's tools to break the master's house, so to speak. But in order to use these tools, we need to recognize what their original purpose was. Mutual questions. How credible is a document that calls itself a common standard of achievement for all peoples and nations in the preamble? If it does not recognize that, at its writing, most of the global South was under European colonial rule and subject to the vilest economic exploitation by the merchants of capital. It is difficult to believe that such an omission was an oversight. At the time, there was an epochal contest between socialism and capitalism. This too appears to have been conveniently overlooked in the basic text. Or was it? My submission is that there was a surreptitious recognition of secularism, capitalism, and political democracy through the guarantee of rights that yield a society framed by those systems. End quote. Human rights are in this way modeled after a Western ideology. There is an emphasis on the individual, on political and civil rights, and the exaltation to right to property. These rights mean very, very little to those whose very existence is threatened. Although Latin American delegations had a hand in proposing social and economic rights, these have been historically sidelined in favor of political and civil rights. At the heart of this confrontation was a broader discussion of whose ideology would conquer, in whose image would the world be crafted. Evidently, the capitalist model prevailed. Therefore, we need to recognize the underpinnings of the human rights framework. If there are flaws in the system, it is because they were intentionally built in from its very conception. Human rights help us to denounce poverty, but fall short in denouncing the unequal economic systems that lead to said poverty. They can be used as a system of policing the poor and underdeveloped countries while advancing the interests of the so-called first world. Having said this, we must recognize that there is power in human rights discourse. As Estado Santos states, there is no question today about the global hegemony of human rights as a human dignity discourse. Articulating an issue through the human rights language and institutions carries a certain weight that lends visibility to the problematics which might otherwise be ignored. However, I ask if Puerto Rico even fits within the scope of international rights. We're well aware of Puerto Rico's complicated positionality. We are foreign in a domestic sense. Puerto Rico is under the jurisdiction of the United States and is therefore a domestic issue, not private to international discussion. At least that's the United States argument for excluding us from the agenda of the General Assembly in the United Nations. Meanwhile, we're not fully protected under the Constitution. Congress's plenary powers justify the discriminatory practices, such as the fact that, on average, Puerto Ricans receive $74 per month in federal support for living expenses, compared with the mainland average of $540. Human rights abuses in the island have been discussed in the framework of human rights. Even though Puerto Ricans do not have representation in the United Nations, Cuba and Venezuela have repeatedly presented resolutions for the decolonization of the island to the Committee for Decolonization. Puerto Rican delegations from all three major parties have presented themselves before the organization, denouncing Puerto Rico's colonial status. While the committee recognizes that Puerto Rico's status does not comply with Resolution 1514 or 1541 as a political status that is no longer colonial in nature, the case has not been included in the agenda of the General Assembly. The fact that Puerto Rico is still a subject to the territorial clause is cause enough to denounce human rights violations, let alone the economic exploitation caused by the Jones Act. Unfortunately, Puerto Rican hands are tied by an unequal international system and domestic impotency. Given that Puerto Ricans occupy the space between rights, we're left dispossessed by both human rights and constitutional rights. The violation of Puerto Rican rights extends beyond the general idea of self-determination and into the material conditions caused by an unequal relationship with the United States. The United Nations now denounces the violations of Puerto Rican social and economic rights. What is not mentioned is that any attempt by Puerto Ricans to protect said rights was thwarted by the United States in their ongoing fight against communism. This was perhaps most evident in the debates over the Sección 20 of the Puerto Rican Constitution. The Constitutional Assembly attempted to model their own constitution in the spirit of human rights, following the example of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In response, the United States government reiterated their status as non-subjects of rights. And I quote, Section 20 of Article 2 purports to recognize the so-called human rights. We may pass for present purposes the question as to whether these or any of them are in fact human rights and under our system of government should have constitutional protection. Because of the novelty of the assertion of these so-called rights as constitutional rights, the confusions and uncertainties to which we have referred are not remedied by our judicial precedents and constitutional theory. These so-called human rights in question were the right to a free elementary and secondary education, the right to obtain work, the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and the well-being of himself and his family, and especially to food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, the right to social protection in the event of unemployment, sickness, old age, or disability, and the right of motherhood and childhood to special assistance. As Dr. Brenner tells us, the United States lawmakers refused to approve the original version of the Constitution as it contained, and I quote, language that both privileged a democratic system of government and supported the recognition of social and economic rights for the residents of the island. The Special Rapporteur's declaration seems especially ironic in light of these discussions. How can human rights be sidelined when we were never privy to them? Currently, the human rights discourse is being invoked to denounce the critical state in the island. As of 2015, over 150 schools have shut down due to the economic crisis. Major hospitals such as San Jorge and Auxilio Mutuo have been forced to close down floors or entire wings in order to save money. It is estimated that as much as one physician a day is leaving the island. Meanwhile, the Federal Control Board proposes a 28% reduction in healthcare expenditure by 2019, a 22% reduction of government personnel, and a 10% reduction in pension expenditures, a reduction of government outlays to higher education amounting to 28% as part of the first-year fiscal plan presentation. Today, the University of Puerto Rico is on strike against these measures and against a $450 million budget cut to the institution. It's worth mentioning that the Promesa bill, which instituted the Federal Control Board, was in theory an answer to the humanitarian crisis in the island. The austerity measures being instituted are supposedly intended as a lifeline for the people of Puerto Rico. Although Congress was very explicit, the bill would not be a bailout. Civil society groups, especially the diaspora community in the United States, expected the bill to at least assist in relief for the island. This has, of course, not been the case. Nobel Economics laureate Joseph Stiglitz criticizes the 10-year fiscal plan approved by the Federal Control Board as it prioritizes the interests of creditors over the inhabitants of the island. I quote, the policies that have been put forward, I believe, will in fact lead to another lost decade for Puerto Rico. It will cause enormous amounts of distress. With a declining population and escalating taxes, the situation in Puerto Rico is not only dire, it's getting worse. Furthermore, Governor Ricardo Rosselló's labor reform reduces vacation days, sick days, diminishes pay for overtime, and alters the law protecting workers from unfair termination. As we know, these are but a few of the actions being taken by both La Junta and the island's local government that put Puerto Ricans in such a precarious condition. To talk about human rights abuses without taking into consideration the intricate past that has led us into this position limits our ability to fully grasp the situation and therefore to combat it. The sidelining of human rights is not a new phenomenon in this crisis. It is embedded into our very Constitution, which privileges the payment of public debt over essential government operations, as stated in Article 6, Section 8. The odds have been against us for decades, which has recently reached the boiling point. If we limit the human rights to the legal institutions that are codified in international covenants or declarations, we risk limiting the power and the space of rights. The United States never signed the ICSCR. Therefore, Puerto Ricans, or even United States citizens living in the mainland, have no claim to such basic rights as higher education or the right to a decent standard of living, rights which were incidentally included in the previously discussed Section 20. This is a major limit of articulating rights through the human rights institutions. They may exist as an ideal, but they lack enforceability. More so if a country refuses to sign a covenant. There are those who seek to articulate human rights as human dignity. The use of human rights language as a tool to validate claims outside of specific legal frameworks of the United Nations. While this works in theory as a galvanizing tool, this method also falls short. Even if we attempt to frame the health and education crisis in the island using a human rights discourse, but outside the legal institutions, this paradigm is inadequate to explore the underlying causes of the crisis. Human rights are complicit in reproducing the liberal, capitalist, and colonial logic which is at the heart of the current crisis. Limiting ourselves to a human rights discourse limits the types of rights claims that we can make and the methods through which we can articulate them. As Rousseau tells us, we need to work with today's reality while imagining what could be possible in the future. I'm not arguing that we need to forget human rights entirely, for now they may be the best tool that we have. I am saying, however, that we can't constrain our discussions to the human rights language and that we need to recognize the limits of rights. We can't forget that Puerto Rico's Constitution, which sets the stage for our predicament by denying social and economic rights and explicitly prioritizing the interests of creditors over the people, was precisely what allowed for Puerto Rico to be removed from the list of colonial territories in the United Nations. In order to affront the crisis, we need to look beyond human rights and toward a framework that may allow us to combat the colonial relationship and the neoliberal politics that are at the heart of the Puerto Rican struggle. Promesa is perhaps the most overt form of neo-colonialist, capitalist violence. However, this is nothing new for us. Puerto Ricans have had to deal with these forms of violence long before this law was passed. I say this not to undermine the severity of the situation, but to set it historically as an abuse that our colonial country has been subjected to. No más promesas rotas.
Thank you, Ortiz Chico. I hope that we can take a couple of minutes to pose questions to our panelists before we transition to the next activity. And given the time, I was wondering if the panel is open to receiving 2 or 3 questions at a time and then responding to your individual questions. Okay. Preguntas.
I actually do have a question for Jose. You talked about the best practices in some of the community organizations in Puerto Rico. Can you repeat those? I only got like 4. What was
Can you speak out?
Alright, I didn't realize that, but I can speak. I can speak. So Jose mentioned some of the community organizations on the island that have some of the best practices in terms of sort of involving folks on the island, and I was just asking if he could. I think you mentioned 4, and I got 2, so I'd love to hear the other 2.
Yeah, I mentioned Sister Isolina Ferre Centers. A La Paz, which is the Alliance for Social Peace, that the people working with the victims. It's there, right there. It's
There. It's Sister Isolina Ferrer Centers in Community Initiative. Intercambios Puerto Rico, both dealing with drug addictions, needle exchange, and condom distribution and that kind of services. Taller Salud, which is a wider variety of services, but they deal with the initiative Cure the Violence, that is actually a U.S. Department of Justice initiative in Chicago, and with John Jay College, David Kennedy's. And they took the training with the people of Chicago, and they implemented in Loíza and have a surprisingly highly reduction, like from 80 murders to like 8.
Wow.
In a year, in a couple of years, and have been successful keeping the rate down. And Laura Ponte Alliance for Social Peace, it's a victim service. It's probably the only one, which right now it's free service, but they all depends on funds and proposals and stuff, and PROMESA is putting them in danger to suffer from that cuts.
Thank you.
I want to, can you put back the graph on murders? No,
Yeah, the first one.
The first one. There you go. There are a number of things that I have questions about, and as a criminalist, you may want to work on this if you haven't. Because, for example, if you look at if you look, I was telling that I want, this is the graph of murders in Puerto Rico, and it's a 20th century, 21st century graph, and I think it's very
1900 to 2000.
yeah, very useful. And if you look at the period of Operation Bootstrap, which is 1950 to about 1970, you can see two slopes there. One before the 60s, where you have the 100 and the very low one.
The first and the very low one.
Then you have the 168, and then you have the 192. I think that the partition there, when the 168, is the sort of arrival to Puerto Rico of Vietnam veterans with drugs. And I always think of drugs as the watershed for violence in Puerto Rico. But then you have another very interesting spike in the 70s, and then you got an onwards, a sort of upwards pattern there, and that is explained not just by drugs in terms of the arrival of drugs, but in terms of the rivalry between gangs and the formation of gangs. And it seems to me that it is very interesting to try to see what are the factors. I mean, you did give certain factors, but it seems to me that machismo, machismo was always there. People fighting with machetes for a woman in the Cañaveral were there. The questions are, what are the specific elements that within a period account for those fights?
Machismo has been always there, as I said. It comes from Spain, probably, certainly. But the feeling of frustration, because we are no longer, the male is no longer able to sustain his family, and the ones who were constructed precisely in the 50s and 60s as middle class, when they were actually poor workers, but they feel like middle class. They were made feel like middle class. But then came the beginning of the new rise of crisis of the neoliberalism from the oil crisis on. It put a lot of pressure, and if you add that there was not domestic violence lost in the 50s and 60s, and then were created, that you create a crime. Crime is what is defined by the law, and once it's created, then will be cases. So that probably is the reason, one of the other reasons. Yeah, there are several. It's because this paper wasn't focused on the criminal discussion itself. But yes, I agree, and I thank you for I haven't had before, and it's probably true, the coming in of the veterans from Vietnam and the mental health the raising mental health problems that were not attended because, as I tell my students nowadays who are recruited into the armed forces, the services for veterans in Puerto Rico are exactly the same that were from the 60s Vietnam veterans. And the services are the same. So they keep coming with their problems and no extra services are provided. And that will reflect later in violence.
Drugs. It was better than drugs. I think it's the rise of what we call
Yeah.
And the pecados were the petty thieves and the people who mocked you. And so I think the periodization of that would be very interesting.
Yeah, it will. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish to first to thank all the ponentes for the magnificent presentations, and I could make commentaries to all of them, but I'm going to just make one comment, which I'm going to make it because I think it has to do with what we have to do now in the situation in Puerto Rico today. And it has to do with one of the things that the first, Roisel, your final comment I think was very to the point in the terms that the low-wage policies in Puerto Rico and other policies as well affect Puerto Rican workers and the Puerto Rican people, but they also affect very negatively workers in the United States. And therefore we should oppose them, not only because they affect Puerto Rican workers in Puerto Rico, but also because they affect U.S. working people. And I think that's a key point. I tried to bring that out in my presentation yesterday, which is that all of our struggles are going to be defeated if they are isolated. The students in Puerto Rico are now on strike. If they remain alone, if other people in Puerto Rico do not come to support them, it's going to be very hard for them to be victorious. So they have to be joined by other people in struggle. But in the same fashion, the struggle against Promesa in Puerto Rico is going to be very, very difficult to win if we are alone, if we are not supported from outside of Puerto Rico, including, I would say, beginning with struggles in the United States. And what I wanted to underline yesterday was that support for Puerto Rico can not only be based on sympathy for Puerto Rico. These people are struggling and we have to support them because that's important. But it's also for us to understand it here in the US that it's the same struggle. People here are struggling against the Trump agenda. But struggling against the Trump agenda means struggling for the same things that we have to struggle in Puerto Rico. And we have to find some ways in which we can link what we are doing in Puerto Rico against Promesa with what's going on in the United States against this terrible neoliberal, or whichever way you want to call it, agenda. And I think that's an important thing for us to bring out of this conference and similar events in the United States.
Another question.
I just wanted to add that was a main point that I make in this paper, but also in my larger project, is that these narratives of Puerto Rico's marginality and that it's in need and that you're supposed to have sympathy for it is part of what has masked these economic manipulations for decades. And that it does have to be from a point of solidarity amongst workers and unions across the mainland and island to all coordinate to block further exemptions for Puerto Rican workers. So thank you for adding to that.
I've been talking to Agustin for the last 2 days, but there's here also where it's very important that what I call talks or diálogos nacionales or diálogos comunitarios start also within the diaspora and between the diaspora and the people still living on the island. Sometimes when you see it from the island perspective, for the island, the diaspora is invisible. Let's be honest, it's invisible. But I know for working close to some people here in the mainland that there is real efforts from organizations, like the ones in Puerto Rico here, like Semilla de Bienestar, that's another one here in the US, that they are trying to make an impact in Puerto Rico, and sometimes they feel like there is a lack of support because from the people of Puerto Rico look at them like they are outsiders. And at least I'm from a group, maybe it's something from Ponce, I don't know. But we do not, in opposite of most people believe, not the Ponce is Ponce. No. Actually, we value those people and we work with them and we welcome them, and we just a couple of weeks ago have a conference where I think was about social movement in the US, because we want our students to learn things that happen here that crystallize on important legal and social results, like what the Young Lords and the Black Panthers did in New York and Chicago. And now we have comedores escolares. We have those services weren't there before. They start to serve the kids on the streets of New York. So the people in Puerto Rico need to learn also from the experience of the diaspora. And sometimes I'm missing that word and that work, both work and work, in this kind of conference. That's just my
Hi, I'm John Brigham. I teach constitutional law here. I lived in the diaspora in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which began the conference talking about the population there. But what I wanted to comment on is this amazing combination of critique of need and discussion of law, because in this teaching of constitutional law, which I do, there's a tendency to look at the U.S. Supreme Court to try and understand what they say. And of course, even for a long time, they have been saying very good things for Puerto Rico, but even more recently, dramatically bad things. But beyond that, deeper than that, in a way that this conference is getting at, the thing that's exciting for me is the absence of even a discussion of colonialism within the teaching of constitutional law. The way the United States addresses this, the law books, there's no place for it. So to even try and introduce that, not out of need, but out of education, out of trying to understand. There's so much to just explain about what's been going on, which is understood here, and so it's much a basic part of this conversation. But it's so absent in the area that I work in, and incredibly powerful and exciting just to recognize. I mean, one of the references to the human rights position and taking Puerto Rico off the list of colonies. But in the United States, it's one way to look at these recent cases, as we've talked about, they make things clearer. So in making things clearer about this dependency status, to be teaching it in a university like this and offering things that are like, oh my God, you didn't even understand that. There's no place to say it, is an exciting part of this project, and a place of struggle, not at the same level of struggle, but a very necessary part of the struggle, I think.
Final questions? Of course. Of course.
I agree with what just the professor said, but maybe because the concept of colony is absent in the U.S. Constitutional law. They talk about territories, incorporated or unincorporated, but they never use the word colony. On the other hand, at law schools in Puerto Rico, yes, we do work with the insular cases, but again, that shows up that it's not a Puerto Rico problem alone, and that may be another. I agree with Dr. Bernabe. That's maybe another stop. I never seen initiatives from the Puerto Rican pro-independence movement to reach to other independence movements in all of those islands that were a lot more than sometimes you would like to believe. And they were acquired by different means, but they all share the same framework from the constitutional law, U.S. constitutional law point of view. So I agree with you that there should be more discussion up here.
Okay, if there are no more questions, first, thank you to our panelists for sharing their knowledge and their time with us today. And thank you all for attending and posing your questions, which I suspect will continue over lunch and into this afternoon. I think right now the smell of the food is pulling us in another direction. Thank you.